So, genetics is one of the fundamental biological processes underlying many different aspects of human health and human disease. Most diseases have some sort of genetic contribution, but the actual character of that genetic contribution can vary pretty drastically. So, most people are familiar with genetics in terms of Gregor Mendel. Everybody studied Gregor Mendel and his pea plants in high school biology. And the traits that Gregor Mendel tended to study were traits where you had one of two outcomes. So, something like flower color. So, some flowers may have white, some plants may have white flowers, and some plants may have red flowers. But what Gregor Mendel found is that the genetics of those plants will actually tell you whether or not it will have white or red flowers. Now, in and of itself, that's interesting and certainly of relevance to human health. But what about traits that aren't just one of two outcomes? What about something like height or weight? Something where you have a whole spectrum of outcomes? Well, those are quantitative genetic traits. So in Gregor Mendel's case, those traits tended to be controlled by one or a handful of genes. But in the case of quantitative genetics, you have dozens or hundreds or thousands of genes that are all making very minute contributions to a particular trait. So in the case of height, if you have gene A and gene B and gene C, each one of those may tend to make you a little bit taller. But if you also have gene X, Y, and Z, each one of those may tend to make you a little bit shorter. And so whenever you look at the sum total of the contribution of all these different genes that you have, they give you your observed phenotype. And so the fact that you have so many different genes all contributing to this one phenotype give you a whole spectrum of possibilities that you can obtain. And that's a very interesting lens through which to view human health and human disease. So if you look at a very complex disease, something like drug addiction, it may be tempting to look at somebody who's addicted and say they either have addiction or they don't have addiction. And you could potentially look for a magical gene that either makes somebody prone to addiction or maybe they're resistant to addiction. But in fact, addiction tends to be a quantitative trait. People tend to have more or less susceptibility to something like addiction. And knowing that changes how you approach that particular research problem. So in my own research, I use fruit flies as a model organism to study addiction. And so what I do is I take groups of flies that are genetically distinct and I measure some sort of trait across all these different groups. So I may measure how much drug all these different flies consume. I may measure what their brain structure is. And after measuring that trait, I can look at differences in those traits among all these different flies and compare those differences to the differences that I see in their genetics. And by finding correlations in genetic differences and trait differences, we can start to identify genes or places in the genome that may be contributing to that observed phenotype or trait. And so that's a very, very powerful way to study a complex disease. And what's very interesting is once you begin to uncover the genetics that underlie those types of traits, then it's not out of the question that you could possibly predict those types of traits. So for instance, if we know that a particular gene may predispose somebody to cocaine addiction, and we also know that a particular structural abnormality in the brain may also correlate with susceptibility to addiction, then it's not out of the question that you could screen somebody's genome for risk genes and maybe scan their brain to see if they are carrying that brain abnormality. Based on that, you could advise them on how susceptible they are to addiction. And that opens up a lot of preventative therapeutics that could help alleviate that sort of disease. And until we have a deeper understanding of genetics and how they play into complex diseases, those types of predictive therapies are going to be hard to come by.